Everybody, thanks so much for watching, listening to Fire Breathing Rob. If you're listening to us the first time, please subscribe, like, and share on the YouTube. If you're listening to us on the radio, if you're listening to us on the podcast, thanks so much. Definitely share that with your friends, your family members, with anybody you can get your hands on. We appreciate that. Today, we have somebody special, and we're going to be talking about a disease that a lot of people know about, but people, don't really know about in general. They think they know about it, I guess we should say, Lisa. And we're going to be talking about Alzheimer's. We're going to be talking about dementia too. We're going to talk about how COVID-19 has really made that process of dementia and Alzheimer's too even possible. Now we're seeing that in studies. So we're going to kick around a lot of topics here today. And this is Lisa Skinner, and she's knows a lot about all this information, and she's going to go into this with us, and we're going to kick it around. So, Lisa, first of all, thanks so much for coming on. Greatly appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
All right. Well, I'm happy you're on because we got a lot to learn today for these millennials listening, because this is an important topic that's been getting worse and worse, unfortunately, as we talk about healthcare as years go on. But we'll discuss that in general. But before we even go into all these illnesses, can we talk about you, Lisa, and just a little bit about you for the audience?
Sure. Well, I have been working as what's called a behavior specialist for the last almost 26 years. And what I have been doing is counseling families and helping families navigate through the very challenging obstacles that accompany having a loved one with brain disease. One of the brain diseases that causes dementia, and there's actually over 100 of them. Most of us are familiar with Alzheimer's disease. That is the most common form of dementia. And it's the one that we hear about in the news, and, celebrities have been diagnosed, but there are a lot of different brain diseases that cause dementia. So I've been doing this for many, many years, and I lead support groups, and I have a best-selling book out, and I train caregivers, or I used to, and I counsel families, and I really help people understand what living with Alzheimer's disease is really like, because it's much more complicated than meets the eye. A lot of people associate the disease with memory loss and confusion, which actually is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. But it's so much more layered than that. So this is what I've been doing. And this is kind of unheard of, but in addition to doing this professionally for the last 25 years, sure, I've also had 8 of my own family members afflicted with one of the brain diseases that causes dementia. 5 of them family members, and 3 of them were through marriage. So I've walked in everybody's shoes on both sides of the fence, and I really understand and empathize with the heartache that these families go through when a loved one is diagnosed with one of the diseases that causes dementia. And the difficult part about it is it's a long process to go through this disease. My grandmother was my very first experience with Alzheimer's disease, and she lived with it for 20 years. So it's not something that you get a diagnosis and they're gone in a year. This is a long haul, and there's so many complications to this disease. So I basically help people navigate through this journey so they'll have a better quality relationship with their loved one and enjoy the time that they have left with them.
You brought up Alzheimer's disease. So am I, and I don't know much about this topic, but I'm learning as we go here. So are we saying like dementia is, the big disease, And then under that, there's certain diseases such as Alzheimer's, and then, like you said, the 100 other diseases. Is that what you're saying then?
No. So let me clarify that, because
Okay, go ahead.
this is actually a misconception with most people.
Right.
Dementia isn't a specific disease. Alzheimer's is a disease. There are many brain diseases that cause dementia. So when we use the term dementia, it's usually, I mean, it's really an umbrella term that's used broadly to describe the symptoms that show up with the brain diseases.
Okay.
And there are so many symptoms. So to kind of put this in perspective for the listeners, if you aren't feeling well and you go to your doctor and your doctor says to you, so what brings you in today? You're probably going to say to him or her, oh my gosh, I am not feeling well. I have a splitting headache. I have a fever. My body aches from head to toe. I've had chills, my stomach. So what you're describing are your symptoms, right? And then your doctor will probably, through process of elimination, diagnose what your actual illness is, probably a cold or the flu or something like that. So think of dementia as the symptoms that go with the disease, and the actual disease is Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontotemporal lobe disease, Lewy body disease. That's the one that Robin Williams was diagnosed with. So disease causes dementia, and that's really describing the symptoms. And there are tons of symptoms.
So this is hereditary then?
It can be.
Okay.
So I would consider myself a high risk for developing dementia because I've had 5 blood relatives succumb to it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I will get it. It's just put me at a higher risk. So millennials, this is really important because this disease typically shows up after the age of 65. But there are things that you can start doing now to lower your risk of developing it. And if Rob wants, we can go into that.
Yeah, let's go into that, please.
But there is a hereditary form of Alzheimer's disease that's called early onset Alzheimer's disease. That is genetic, but that still doesn't mean that if you, and it shows up before the age of 65, that's the difference. Regular Alzheimer's shows up after the age of 65. Early onset can show up in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. Wow. And it is genetic, but that doesn't mean that if you're predisposed to it, that you will get it.
So what contributes to getting these diseases?
There's
besides the genetics, of course.
Besides what?
Oh, sorry. I didn't know if there was a delay or not. I know. Besides the genetics, what contributes to getting these diseases? Is it lack of sleep or not eating correctly or?
Yeah, those are some of them. So there are a multitude of what we call high risk factors. The number one high risk factor is age. So after the age of 65, you become higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. The second highest risk factor, and this is surprising to a lot of people, is cardiovascular disease. Having sleep apnea is a risk factor. Not getting proper exercise is a risk factor. Having diabetes is a risk factor. Having hearing loss, there's been a link to hearing loss and dementia. That's a risk factor. So think of it this way, the more of these factors that are stacking up against you, the higher your risk is of developing dementia at a later age. So our goal is to negate those risk factors, and you have some that are modifiable and manageable, and you have some that are not. Age is not a modifiable risk factor. We all are going to get older, and you're going to reach that age where that you're stuck with that being a risk factor. But if you have cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, or one of the other sub-diseases to cardiovascular disease, and you're being treated, then that negates that as being a high risk factor, and you can kind of, you know, not worry so much about that one. Or diabetes, if your diabetes is under control, your A1C is at a good number, and you're managing your diabetes, well, that goes from being a very high risk factor of developing Alzheimer's disease at some point in your life to, okay, it's not as high a risk because it's being managed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, my thing is
Yeah, one of the
go ahead. I'm sorry.
So one of the things that I advise people who are much younger and they think, oh, well, you know, I don't have to worry about it now. I'm 35 years old. There are things you can start doing now that are going to lower your risk of developing it. And the main things is exercising regularly, even if it's walking. Walking is very good exercise for lowering that risk factor, and eating a healthy diet, more along the lines of Mediterranean, like whole grains and less red meat, more lean meats, vegetables, unprocessed foods. So kind of in those categories, if people just adhere to a healthier diet, that actually lowers their risk factor of developing dementia.
So, and for everybody that's listening, if you're just tuning in, this is Lisa Skinner. We're talking about dementia. We're going to be talking about her book in just a moment, too. I want to go into this. So, you know, when I think of memory personally, and I'll probably be ignorant on this topic because I'm still learning as we're speaking about this, you know, some people have really good long-term memory. Some people have really good short-term memory. Say you don't have, you know, say your short-term memory is not as good as your long-term. Is that an issue where you may get Alzheimer's or you may get some sort of disease?
Okay, so that is a really great question. And
Yeah.
let me explain that. Alzheimer's disease damages the first part of the brain that does damage to is the short-term memory.
Mhm.
The long-term memory stays intact for almost to the end of the disease.
Oh, wow.
Term memory is not impacted like your short-term. So the best way for me to describe what happens to the short-term memory during these stages that you progress through during this disease, and again, it can take years from the onset of the symptoms to the very end. Most people aren't diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease till they're already in the mid stage of the disease, because the signs and the symptoms in the first part, and that can be for years, are very, very subtle. They go unnoticed. A lot of people might just chalk it up to, oh, I'm getting older. This is just normal forgetfulness, which it could be.
Yeah.
So by the time it becomes so obvious that it's more of a serious problem, most people are already into the mid stage, and that's typically when doctors will make the diagnosis. So this is what happens to your short-term memory during this whole disease process. Think of it like a switch that turns a light bulb on. In the beginning stages of the disease, that switch is on most of the time, and your short-term memory is functioning just fine. And every so often, that switch just gets flipped off. And when that happens, you can't remember what you had for breakfast that morning, because that's your short-term memory bank. You start pulling your memories from your long-term memory, and then you actually believe in your mind that you're living back in a past time. So during the progression of the disease, that switch that's managing your short-term memory is on sometimes, most of the time, and then it just shuts off. On, off, on, off. During the middle stages, it's on sometimes and off maybe half the time. By the end of the disease, it's shut off almost completely. And the person suffering from Alzheimer's is living through their past memories because that's all that's left.
So let me ask you this then, Lisa, because I was always told, and I have a lot of friends that are a lot older than me, we'll just say that. I have a couple of friends that are in their 70s, and they tell me, they always read the newspaper. They always keep up to date with what's going on in the news. They do crossword puzzles, just to keep their mind going. If is that a good idea for somebody that's worried about Alzheimer's? I assume you're going to say yes on that.
It's essential.
Yeah.
Brains are organs just like, our biceps and our triceps and everything else that we spend a lot of time at the gym trying to keep healthy. If you don't exercise your brain, it will do exactly the same thing that our muscles do. They shrink and they atrophy and they just kind of become lifeless. So that's one of the things that's definitely recommended as a way to reduce your risk factor of developing is to keep your mind active. And some of the best things to do, crossword puzzles is good. The number one recommended thing to do is to learn a foreign language, because the parts of your brain that you have to really work hard to accomplish that is really, really advantageous to keeping the brain stimulated. There's other things like taking some classes.
Yeah.
Things that challenge you, not just watching a movie on television. Because that's not really challenging your brain. So anything
I agree.
actually challenges your brain to work and to think and to go on, turbocharge. Those are the type of things that are recommended to stay cognitively healthy.
How do people live with the disease? Because I know it can be really hard when people do get older and they kind of have that feeling that they know, the time is up as far as their brain time, and they're starting to lose a lot of the and have these issues in general. So how do you help them live with these issues? And because I know a lot of people get frustrated, they start yelling and screaming and, fight with their loved ones and stuff. And it's really sad when that happens. So how do you help these people work and get through these problems that they have, and that there's honestly probably no way to correct in general?
There actually are a lot of practices that you can put into place that will diffuse a situation from escalating versus, responding to somebody that just causes it to blow up. But what you're describing are a lot of the behaviors that we see when people are suffering from brain disease. And eventually, they suffer such a cognitive decline as a result of the damage being done to the brain that most of them are no longer able to verbalize or articulate what's bothering them. If they're in pain, if they're too hot, if they're cold, if they're not feeling well. So the way that they communicate with us is through these behaviors, some of the ones that you just described, anger and agitation. And so people with dementia, and this is what I advise family members, these behaviors are their way of trying to tell you something.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just trying to be difficult or nasty or mean. They're trying to tell you that there's something wrong because they can't tell you that there's something wrong. So what I teach families is to learn to recognize the behaviors, and then you have to decode the behavior to get to the root of what has triggered this behavior. And this is like, detective work. It's, any of us who have been parents, and when our children, before they were able to talk to us, they would tell us in other ways that there was something wrong. And typically that was crying or having a tantrum.
Right.
And it was up to the parents to figure out, what do we need to do for this child to make them comfortable? This is exactly what happens with people with cognitive impairment. They communicate with us through these behaviors that show up, and we're tasked with having to figure out what it is that they need or want or is bothering them. So, and then in addition to that, once you recognize that the behavior is part of the illness, this is not just intentional bad behavior, decode the behavior, try to get to the root and the bottom of the problem. And then there's a proper way to approach the response, how you respond or react to that behavior. And there's an improper way that can set off a catastrophic reaction if it's not handled in the best practice way.
Well, I think people need people like you, because I know a lot of people that are suffering with a loved one through these illnesses. They really don't know how to, you can tell them that's how they're trying to communicate, but for for most people, they won't understand it. They won't get it. They, like you said, they might just think they're being mean and nasty, ornery, where they're really just struggling to get across the message of how you're feeling. So, how do you really get that across to some people that it's, I'm sure that you have those people where it's really hard to get that message across.
It's learning a new set of skills is really what it's about. It's like if your loved one, your grandfather, let's say, all of a sudden lost his ability to hear, either partially or fully. And you go to visit him, and it's like you're struggling to try to communicate with him because he can't hear a thing you're saying. Well, you want to try to figure out another way to communicate with him. And fortunately for the hearing impaired, there are lots of different things that are available. There are hearing aids, there's special telephones, there's sign language. But the point being is we have to learn a new set of skills to work around their disability and learn a new effective way. And this is exactly what I encourage people to do, because it can be done. There are a lot of tools out there to provide people with a new set of skills to communicate with people who have Alzheimer's disease and dementia. But it's like learning a new language.
Lisa Skinner here on Fire Breathing Rob. Let's talk about the book. So can you tell people a little bit about the book, why you wanted to write it?
Okay, so the book is called Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. And it's a true compilation of real life stories, and every chapter depicts these different behaviors that show up, and then advice on how to recognize that that's a behavior related to the disease and basically how to deal with it. I mentioned early on that I have been counseling families for a couple decades now. And, along the path, people say, oh, Lisa, I never understood this disease until you explained it to us the way you explained it to us. And all of a sudden, it just started to make sense. I was called over to a client's house one time, and they were kind of facing a double whammy. Her father had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and her husband's mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, both about 2 years earlier.
Gosh.
They were frustrated to the end because they explained to me that they were having a really difficult time finding resources and information to help them understand what to expect, how to deal with these day-to-day things that show up. It's a lot of obstacles that just kind of pop up and are get in your way every single day, and nothing is predictable. So anyway, long story short, I answered their questions and explained things to them for about 2.5 hours. And she stops me after about 2.5 hours and she says, Lisa, we've gotten more helpful and valuable information from you in the last 2.5 hours than we have anywhere else in the last 2 years since we both got these diagnoses. She says, you've got to write a book. People are desperate for this information. Right. Not so much from a medical perspective. Yeah, our doctor told us what it is, but from a day-to-day dealing with it every single day perspective. Right. And even though I'd been thinking about it for a long time, but I really had never put aside the time to write the book, It was kind of my aha moment, because just the way she presented it to me, I knew she was right. I've been hearing that from a lot of people for years. And so I finally set aside a time,
gave in.
And I wrote the book. So hopefully it'll be a really valuable resource for people who are looking for help on how do they communicate with their loved one? Because most people are feeling that their visits with their loved one are just full of anxiety and stress and difficulty. And I want to take that away for them by giving them the tools that they need to learn how to speak this new language and have a high quality relationship and enjoy the time they have left with their loved one.
Lisa Skinner here on Fire Breathing Rob. I want to talk about the aspect of COVID. I don't know if you've been really looking into this, but I know that COVID, there's been talk if you have COVID, it could lead toward brain disease in general. We hear a lot about brain fog and all these other neurological illnesses due to COVID or even long haul of COVID. Are you worried that this could be a serious epidemic, even when COVID is long gone and fully contained?
I am very worried that Alzheimer's disease is headed towards being the next world crisis. Mm-hmm. And it's primarily because the baby boomers are the largest human population ever to exist. There's a lot of baby boomers coming of age now. They're in their early to mid 70s. And the Alzheimer's Association is projecting that if a cure is not found by the year 2050, the number of Americans who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease are going to triple. There's 6.2 million Americans now living with Alzheimer's. And that's just Alzheimer's. That's only one of the brain diseases that causes dementia. And so that's just the United States. And the Alzheimer's Association's 2021 projections is by the year 2050, that number will be between 13 and 14 million people. That's what worries me. As far as COVID goes, yes. It's my understanding that everything you said does happen to people, but there's not enough research.
Right.
Nobody knows anything about this disease. When we were all first hit with it, they said it was just an old person's disease. Only the elderly got it. And look how much it's changed in our lives in the last year and a half. So yes, people do suffer from brain fog. Is one of the symptoms of, not everybody gets it, right, but a lot of people suffer from brain fog. The long haulers are describing neurological problems, memory problems, problems with vocabulary, things like that. But at least with COVID, we don't know how long it really will last. It could eventually just clear itself up. But
we hope.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are going to know for a long time.
Yeah.
But for Alzheimer's disease, we do have the studies, and that's what worries me, is how many seniors will develop this over the next 20, 25 years if we don't find a cure for it.
Lisa Skinner here on Fire Breathing Rob. Lisa, as we end the interview, can you tell people where they can find the book and learn more about you in general?
2 resources for you. If you are interested in reading the book and finding about more in depth about the behaviors and the best practices for reacting and responding to them, the book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble sellers. I also have a blog on Facebook that anybody is welcome to go to, and I post a lot of this information that we've been talking about to hopefully help those who are really struggling with this disease, either as a caregiver or a family member. So a lot of the things we talked about today, you'll find that information on my blog, and that's also called Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. Same title as the book. So hopefully that will be a valuable resource for any of you who are kind of facing this journey.
Lisa Skinner, thanks so much for your time. Let's do this again down the road.
Thank you, Rob. It was a pleasure to be here, and hopefully a lot of people will get a lot of value out of this information.